On May 29 on Monday, we've got a big election in Alberta between the NDP and the UCP. So let's talk about that election, Spencer Fernando. What are the key issues?
Well, obviously, the future of the oil and gas sector, the relationship between the Alberta government and the federal government, which has become quite contentious, especially given Justin Trudeau's hostility to the Alberta oil and gas sector. And then there's obviously the big ideological differences. I mean, the NDP is proposing what would be a 38% increase in business taxes, which would be, I believe, one of the largest business tax increases anywhere in North America in really many years. So Alberta has a very competitive business tax right now, but they'll lose a lot of that advantage if the NDP tax hike goes through. Obviously, the NDP has tried to cast Danielle Smith, as an extremist. I don't think that's a fair characterization, but that's how they've gone with their campaign. And so I think those are going to be, the big issues. And then, of course, what it will say, for federal politics if the NDP ends up winning in Alberta. That might give a lot of confidence to the Liberals and NDP, which would not be a good thing for Conservatives.
So how does the NDP, in this case with Rachel Notley, walk the line in its relationship between really, frankly, a radical agenda with the Liberal NDP government of shutting down the oil and gas industry? How does that work?
Well, they've tried to talk about how they're, supposedly independent of the federal NDP. She said she disagrees with Jagmeet Singh in the oil and gas sector. The problem is, she has to say that. I don't think that really represents what she believes. I think she does agree with Jagmeet Singh. I think she does agree with Justin Trudeau. But of course, she can't say that in Alberta because she would lose very badly. And so she's tried to distance herself. The problem is there really isn't an independent Alberta NDP. It's not structured the same way as other parties where, the UCP and the Federal Conservative Party are not the same party. You're not automatically a member of one if you're a member of the other. Whereas if you're a member of the Alberta NDP, you're automatically a member of the federal NDP, and Jagmeet Singh is your leader. So in a very real way, Jagmeet Singh is Rachel Notley's boss. And so I think that's been a bit of a problem for them, as they've tried to distance themselves, but they obviously have that connection. The other problem they've had is that many of their candidates, they've tried to portray themselves as a moderate and centrist party, but they're running candidates, I believe 6 of whom have statements where they basically openly admit that they're communists. And so when you have open communists running for your party and then you try to say that you're moderate, a lot of people are not going to buy that.
So the irony is that elections are about choices and public policy, but often I notice that a lot of elections are fought about personalities. They try to paint the leader of the other party in good or dark terms. And so in this case, how would you contrast and compare the styles between Rachel Notley, the head of the NDP, and the Premier Danielle Smith, the head of the UCP?
Well, I think Rachel Notley, has cultivated relatively successfully, given, I think her ideological difference from the majority of the province. She's cultivated a relatively, folksy image. A lot of people seem to, like her personally. They built their campaign largely around her personality because many of their candidates are so extreme. They kind of have to do that, but they've done a relatively decent job. I mean, that's why the election is close in the first place. They've obviously done a few things right politically in terms of their strategy. I think with Danielle Smith, the challenge she has is she's very much a libertarian. And, I think one of the things I noticed in our society lately is people have a tough time differentiating between the idea that someone can disagree with something but not want to use the government to ban it. And Danielle Smith is very much one of those people who's, she believes very much in individual freedom. The government should be relatively limited in what it can do. People should be free to speak their minds even if she disagrees. And that's gotten her in trouble a lot, but at least she does stick to what she believes, which I think is an admirable trait. So in a way, I think the same traits that make her, make a lot of her supporters really support her and her party are the things that she's been criticized on. And I think the question is going to be whether the electorate is able to differentiate between, yes, someone can believe people are able to speak freely and act freely without agreeing with all their actions and all the things that other people say. We'll see if people can differentiate between that. The NDP has tried to make it look like Rachel Notley or Danielle Smith not wanting to ban people or, punish people for saying things. They've tried to make it look like that means she supports what they're saying. And that obviously works. That rhetoric works on some people, but hopefully it won't work on the majority of the electorate.
So we know, Spencer, that in Canadian electoral history, that many elections are decided just by a few thousand votes, if not hundreds or even less. So if you had to give advice to somebody in Alberta, should they actually exercise their vote on Monday, May 29? Does it matter?
Well, of course it matters. And this election more so than many others, just because of the way a lot of the polls are breaking down. I mean, you've got the UCP is going to dominate outside of Edmonton and Calgary. The NDP is going to dominate in Edmonton. And so it's really going to come down mostly to, how a few seats in Calgary go. And so that means that, a few thousand votes, even a few hundred votes, maybe 10, 20 votes could decide the outcome. And so it really does matter. And I think, importantly, especially for Albertans, is that, yes, the NDP, provincially has been saying how it's independent of other parties. It's reasonable and moderate. At the end of the day, the election really is a choice between the agenda of Jagmeet Singh, Rachel Notley, Justin Trudeau, or Danielle Smith. And, as we saw yesterday, Pierre Poilievre endorsing the United Conservative Party. And so I think that people need to realize that, go beyond the personalities of individual leaders or even some of the individual candidates and just look at the broader agenda of the party. The worldview of the NDP and the Liberals, which are basically one and the same now, especially federally, is, it's a very hostile worldview to the attitude in Alberta. Alberta is very much an entrepreneurial province, a low tax province, an oil and gas province, a place that believes people do best when the government gets out of the way and you unleash people's potential and let them achieve. And so that's not how, Jagmeet Singh, Justin Trudeau, and Rachel Notley view the world. They view it more. It's all about victims. It's all about, who oppressed who, who's the bad group, holding back, the greatest achievers, holding back the people who have the most, who can be the most productive, taking more of their money, taking more of their effort and giving it to people, obviously, who are not as productive. And so, there's parts of the country that I guess like that, but I wouldn't see Alberta as being a place that would really want to have that worldview imposed on them.
So in this case, votes matter, and the policies, in fact, you said the worldviews between the NDP and the UCP in this case are very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, the NDP, they openly admit that they're a democratic socialist party, so I find it funny when you call them socialists and they say, oh, no, we're not socialists at all. Well, it's right there in your party calls itself a party committed to imposing democratic socialism. And I mean, they put the democratic in front of it, but of course, socialism tends to not be too democratic, once it's in power for a while. And so, I just think, people need to take parties seriously when they say what they believe. If a party says it's socialist, then they're going to be a socialist party. They're not going to go all at once. Obviously you can't, impose that agenda on people, just, snap your fingers and be socialist, because people will revolt against something that quickly, but certainly they move towards that. And so, taxes will go up. The size of government is going to go up. There's going to be a hostility to, individual freedom of speech, economic freedom. And so, we've seen with how Justin Trudeau has governed the country. He campaigned, a lot of people forget, but he campaigned in 2015 talking about things like Canadian liberty, drug laws that he said were too aggressive and too authoritarian. I'm a hip, cool guy smoking weed. Yeah, we're going to run a few deficits, but don't be too bad. We'll get back to fiscal responsibility. And look at the country now. I mean, you've got China interfering. He appoints someone who's his close friend, to cover all that up. You've got the economy obviously in a terrible situation. Taxes keep going up. The carbon tax, hostility to the oil and gas sector, Bill C-11, C-18, a tax on freedom of speech. He wouldn't have won if he campaigned on those things in 2015. But of course, here we are now, and it's been slowly done to the population. And so again, I can't see Albertans wanting to go in that direction.
All right. I did want to, if I may, ask you another question related to June 19. We've got 4 major federal by-elections coming up. We've got one in Quebec, in Westmount, in Montreal. We've got one in Oxford, in Ontario, and then 2 in Manitoba, one in Winnipeg South, and one in Portage Lisgar. Any surprises there?
Well, I know the one getting the most attention is the Portage Lisgar one, just because it's the Bernier. He's trying to get a seat, and he's targeted that area because I think that's where the PPC did the best in the last election, and so I think people will be watching to see if he makes any gains there. I'd be shocked if he won the riding. I mean, never say never, but I'd be pretty surprised by that, especially given the fact that I think the Conservatives certainly were disconnected from their base under Aaron O'Toole. But that's the whole reason Pierre Poilievre is there in the first place. They've reconnected with their base. He ran a great campaign. The most votes, the most donations of any leadership candidate for any party in Canada's history. And so, one thing I've talked about is Bernier. he's kind of fighting against a version of the Conservative Party that doesn't actually exist anymore. It's the party of Erin O'Toole that he wants to fight against, but that's not who the party is under Pierre Poilievre. So we'll see if his rhetoric works. But again, I imagine people in Portage Lisgar are looking at this and saying, well, the Conservatives are looking pretty good in the polls federally against the Liberals. And so why would you elect someone, Bernier, who his party has no chance of winning? If you elect, Conservative MP, you're electing somebody who could very well be making decisions in the government in a few years' time. And so I think just the most rational move would be to, vote for the Conservative candidate in that area. And so the other areas, we'll see. I think the big question will be the change in the popular vote, because you can't always learn too much from by-elections in most cases. Sometimes it's just low turnout on one side or a really good candidate in the other. But if you see kind of an across-the-board decline in the Liberal popular vote, maybe the NDP goes up a bit, the Conservatives go up, then that would tell you that what we're seeing in the opinion polls with the Liberals dropping is really a trend that's being replicated in actual results.
Well, I think we have a recent Nanos poll for the period ending in May that shows a 5-6% decline in popular support for both the Liberals and the NDP. Do you think that matters in this by-election then?
I think so. If it speaks to broader trends, which I think it does. There've been a few kind of big, you could call them eras, probably not the right word, but you just say eras in Justin Trudeau's popular support and the support of the Liberals. He started out very popular, above 50% in many polls when he first took office. Then he dipped into the mid-40s and stayed there for quite a while. And then you really had the SNC-Lavalin and then, booting out Jody Wilson-Raybould. That put him and the Liberals back into the mid-30s, and they never really recovered from that. And so, a little bit of a rally around the flag effect during the pandemic, which you kind of see in any crisis, but it went back to the mid-30s. And then with the China election interference scandal, they've dipped now into the mid to low or the mid to high 20s. And so that's an interesting development. You can get elected in the mid-30s, the mid to high 20s. You're not going to get reelected. That's when, you have such a significant percentage of the population saying, look, enough is enough, And so that's why the Liberals are going negative. I think they realize that they've obviously lost the support of a vast majority of Canadians. Their only hope to try to get reelected is to try to terrify people about Pierre Poilievre. And again, as I've said before, he's quite an effective communicator, so he doesn't make that easy for the Liberals because the caricature they try to create of him doesn't really match up with what people see when he speaks.
So you're saying for a lot of governments, they play a game of not wanting to talk about the issues, but they'll vilify the other person, the other leader, or kind of distract other issues. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, think about it this way. If the economy was booming and Canada was united and things were going well, then the Liberals wouldn't have to be negative, right? They would be doing well in the polls. People would look around and say, well, housing's affordable, the economy is doing great, oil, gas is cheap, groceries are affordable. This is great. I'm going to reelect whoever's in power. Things obviously are the exact opposite of that, right? And so the Liberals can't say, oh, reelect us because we're doing such a great job. Just look around you. What they have to say is, oh, reelect us because our opponent is pure evil, right? That's what they're going to try to say, right? So that's what all governments do when they've actually failed to govern effectively. They just try to scare you and say, well, things may not be good, but this guy's going to be way worse. So I think people are getting tired of that. And again, because Poilievre is an effective communicator, he makes it more difficult for the Liberals to get away with that.
Okay, so if you don't mind, speaking of scandals, we've got this whole issue of Chinese interference. It's a bad smell. It gets worse and worse as the day goes by. We've learned a lot about through leaks through the intelligence service about the interference of the Communist Party of China, the CPC, in 11 ridings. But we've learned a lot more. And it's interesting how the Prime Minister appointed a rapporteur, David Johnston, the former Governor General. Did that appointment make sense?
Well, it depends, what perspective. Did it make sense from Trudeau's perspective? Certainly, it made perfect sense for him. He appoints someone who was his family friend, someone who is a big fan of China. David Johnston, I believe he has children who've gone to university in China. He's gone there to accept, honorary doctorates or degrees or something like that. Big fan of China. He's been there quite often. And so, yeah, from Trudeau's perspective, it certainly makes sense. You're looking for somebody who has a vested interest in not having a big investigation to how the Canadian political elite is connected to China. David Johnston certainly fits that. And you're looking for someone who's going to make sure there's not a public inquiry. Again, David Johnston certainly fits that. So I think, it makes sense that from Trudeau's perspective. Does it make sense for Canadians? Obviously not. And, the polls show that most people are pretty upset with, the fact that there hasn't been an inquiry. So we'll see. The Liberals give the impression that they're so terrified of the truth coming out that they'd rather take heat for looking like they're blocking the truth. And so we'll see, but there's obviously a lot more to this story.
So as those kinds of scandals unfold, do you think those issues in Ottawa will impact the Alberta election? Do you think that they will stick to the NDP as they try to defend, in many ways, not just their own past record, but the record in the NDP of Ottawa of propping up this Liberal government?
Yeah, I think it makes it more difficult for Rachel Notley, certainly in the final days, just because she's going to have more people who are, Alberta is already very hostile towards the Liberals and the federal NDP, to a lesser extent the federal NDP, but much more so the federal Liberals, who, of course, Jagmeet Singh is associated with now. And, people are watching a lot of news stories about the leader of the NDP federally, who is, could easily make an inquiry happen. I mean, he says we're going to use all the tools at our disposal. All he has to do is just say, well, the supply and confidence agreement with the Liberals is over if there's not a public inquiry, and then Trudeau has to choose between an election or an inquiry. So when people see that Jagmeet Singh's not doing any of that and he's not holding Trudeau accountable, it's not good for Rachel Notley, because people are watching. NDP leader props up Justin Trudeau. Trudeau's not too popular in Alberta, and so it forces her to ask to answer more questions about her connection to that party, what she thinks about these things, And again, she's going to distance herself from it, say it's not relevant to what's happening in Alberta. But politics in Canada is becoming more and more nationalized. There is less and less of a difference between your provincial affiliation and your federal affiliation. Certainly no difference in the NDP, but even other parties are becoming a little more connected. Just social media is a big part of it, right? If you're commenting on Alberta politics, you're following people and reading people who are commenting on federal politics, probably similar viewpoints federally and provincially. And so, the NDP in Alberta has been very desperate to try to very much localize the election, make sure people only talk about Alberta, forget that the rest of the country exists. But of course, it doesn't work like that. The federal government has become so, overbearing and powerful under Justin Trudeau, and has done so much to interfere with, Alberta's economy, that you can't just distance from that and pretend it doesn't exist.
So on Monday, May 29, we have an important election in Alberta, and we urge everyone to exercise their vote and to decide which path Alberta will take.